For 50 years, Margaret thought her brother died alone in Vietnam. Then a letter arrived at her door, a letter that had been lost for half a century. What was written inside would reveal a truth so powerful, it would change not just one family, but an entire community's understanding of sacrifice. Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from, and if you believe that some bonds transcend time and distance, please like and subscribe. Because what you're about to witness proves that love finds a way, even across decades. Margaret O'Sullivan had lived with the silence for 18,263 days. She had counted them, each one marking another day since the telegram arrived at her family's small house in Cedar Falls, Iowa, informing them that her younger brother, Private First Class Michael O'Sullivan, had been killed in action near Da Nang, South Vietnam, on March 15, 1971. She was 23 then, a young teacher just starting her career, when the uniformed officers knocked on their door. Michael was 19, barely old enough to vote, too young to drink legally, but old enough to die for his country on the other side of the world. Now at 73, Margaret sat in the same kitchen where she had received that devastating news 5 decades ago. The house felt larger now, emptier. Her parents had passed away years ago, taking with them the last shared memories of Michael's laugh, his terrible jokes, and the way he always left his bedroom a disaster zone that their mother constantly complained about. The kitchen table where she sat each morning with her coffee was the same one where Michael had signed his enlistment papers against their father's wishes. It was where their mother had cried when she realized her baby boy was really going to war. And it was where Margaret had eaten breakfast alone for the first time in her life, the morning after they received word of his death. Margaret had never married. She told people it was because she was too focused on her teaching career, but the truth was more complicated. How do you trust the world not to take away everyone you love when it had already proven it would? She had built a life of careful distances, meaningful but not too deep, connected but not too vulnerable. The only room in the house that remained exactly as it had been in 1971 was Michael's. Their parents had insisted on keeping it as a shrine of sorts, his baseball trophies still dusty on the shelves, his high school textbooks stacked on the desk, his Jimi Hendrix poster curling at the corners. Even now, decades after her parents' deaths, Margaret couldn't bring herself to change it. She would sometimes stand in the doorway of Michael's room, wondering what kind of man he would have become. Would he have married? Would she have been an aunt? Would he have taken over their father's hardware store or followed through on his crazy dream of becoming a rock star? But mostly, she wondered about his final moments. Had he been afraid? Had he thought of home? Had he forgiven her for the terrible fight they'd had the night before he left for Vietnam? That fight had haunted Margaret for 50 years. Michael had wanted to take their grandfather's watch with him, a pocket watch that had been passed down through 3 generations. Margaret had argued that it was too valuable, too risky to take into combat. She had hidden it from him, and they had screamed at each other in this very kitchen. "You don't trust me with anything," Michael had shouted. "You think I'm still a kid." "You are still a kid," Margaret had shot back. "And you're going to get yourself killed trying to prove you're not." Those were the last words she had spoken to her brother. He had left for the airport the next morning while she was at school, unable to face another argument. She never got to say goodbye, never got to tell him she was sorry, never got to say she loved him. For 50 years, Margaret had carried the weight of those words and the silence that followed. She had written him letters after he deployed, trying to apologize, trying to bridge the gap between them, but she never knew if he had received them before he died. The army had returned his personal effects, but there was nothing from her in his belongings, no sign that he had forgiven her, no indication that he had thought of her in his final days. The grandfather's pocket watch still sat in Margaret's jewelry box, unworn and unmoved. Sometimes she would take it out and hold it, wondering if Michael had hated her for keeping it from him, wondering if he had died angry at his sister. This particular October morning started like all the others. Margaret made her coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and read the local newspaper, while the autumn light filtered through the same curtains their mother had hung decades ago. The routine was comfortable, predictable, safe. She was just finishing the obituaries, a morbid habit she had developed in recent years, recognizing fewer and fewer names as her generation slowly disappeared. When she heard a car pull into her driveway. This was unusual. Margaret rarely had visitors, and never unexpected ones. Through the kitchen window she saw an old pickup truck, well-maintained but clearly from another era. The man who climbed out of the driver's seat moved slowly, carefully, with the deliberate motions of someone whose body had accumulated decades of wear. He was tall and thin, with silver hair beneath a veteran's cap, and he carried himself with a quiet dignity that Margaret recognized, the bearing of a man who had seen too much but carried it with grace. He walked to her front door with purpose, but she could see him pause on the porch, as if gathering courage for whatever brought him here. When the doorbell rang, Margaret felt an unusual flutter of nervousness. She lived alone and was cautious about strangers, but something about this man seemed different. Safe, but important. When she opened the door, the man removed his cap and looked at her with eyes that seemed to carry their own weight of years. "Ma'am," he said, his voice gravelly but kind, "my name is James Chen. I served with your brother Michael in Vietnam." He paused, clearly emotional. "I've been looking for you for a very long time." Margaret's coffee cup slipped from her hand and shattered on the porch, the brown liquid splashing across both their feet. But neither of them moved to clean it up. They just stood there, staring at each other across 50 years of silence and loss. "I have something that belongs to you," James continued, reaching into his jacket pocket. "Something Michael asked me to deliver." James Chen was 89 years old, and he had carried the weight of a promise for exactly 50 years, 2 months and 6 days. Not that he was counting, except that he was. He had been counting every single day since he walked away from Firebase Alpha with a blood-stained letter in his pocket and a dying friend's final words echoing in his ears. The search for Margaret O'Sullivan had consumed the better part of his adult life. It hadn't been constant. There had been years when the demands of his own family, his career as a mechanical engineer, and the normal business of living had pushed the promise to the background. But it never disappeared entirely. The letter remained in his jacket pocket wherever he went, through job interviews and children's graduations and grandchildren's birthday parties, a constant weight that reminded him of unfinished business. Margaret invited him inside, her hands still shaking from the shock of his appearance. She led him to the living room, the formal one that was rarely used, as if the kitchen was too intimate for this conversation. They sat across from each other on furniture that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1970s, and James noticed how much of the house seemed frozen in time. "How did you find me?" Margaret asked, her voice barely above a whisper. James smiled sadly. "It wasn't easy. You've moved twice since 1971, and you changed your name when you got married." "I never married," Margaret interrupted. James looked confused for a moment, then understanding dawned. "Margaret Sullivan, then, in Portland. I've been to Portland 3 times in the past 20 years, looking for a Margaret Sullivan who might have been Michael O'Sullivan's sister." "That was me," Margaret said. "I moved there after I retired from teaching. I thought maybe a change of scenery would help. But I moved back here 5 years ago. This house, it's..." She gestured around the room. "It's where he's supposed to be, you know?" James nodded. He understood about the places where the dead were supposed to be. "I hired a private investigator last year," James continued. "I figured if I was going to keep this promise, I'd better do it while I still could." He found the connection between Margaret O'Sullivan of Cedar Falls and Margaret Sullivan of Portland. "Found out you had moved back here." He paused. "I've been sitting in my truck outside your house for an hour, trying to figure out what to say." Margaret studied his face, looking for traces of the young soldier who had known her brother. "You said you served with Michael. Were you there when?" "Yes," James said simply. "I was there." The weight of that simple statement settled between them. James reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew an envelope, yellow with age and stained with something dark that Margaret didn't want to identify. Her name was written on the front in handwriting she recognized immediately. Michael's messy scrawl that had driven their mother crazy when he was doing homework. "He wrote this the night before we went out on patrol," James said. "March 14th, 1971. He asked me to mail it if something happened to him, but—" James's voice caught. "But everything happened so fast, and then I was medevaxed out, and by the time I was coherent enough to remember the letter, I was already back in the States, and then I couldn't find you." Margaret stared at the envelope but didn't reach for it. "What does it say?" "I don't know," James said. "I never opened it. It wasn't meant for me. But you kept it. For 50 years. "I made a promise," James said. He was a good kid. He talked about you all the time. About how you were the smartest person he knew, how you were going to change the world by teaching kids. He was so proud of you." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "We had a fight before he left. A terrible fight. I said awful things." "He never mentioned any fight," James interrupted gently. "He only ever talked about how much he missed you and how he couldn't wait to get back home to see you." Margaret finally reached for the letter, her hands trembling as she took it from James. The envelope felt impossibly light for something that had carried so much weight for so many years. Would you mind staying while I read it?" she asked. James nodded. "I'd be honored." Margaret carefully opened the envelope, mindful of its age and fragility. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the military stationery they gave to soldiers for writing home. The letter was short. Michael had never been much of a writer. But his words hit Margaret like a physical blow. "Maggie, if you're reading this, something bad happened and I didn't make it home. I asked Chen to mail this for me if that happened because there are things I need you to know. First, I'm sorry about our fight. I was being a dumb kid, trying to act tough because I was scared. You were right about the watch. It was too important to risk losing over here. I'm glad you kept it safe. Second, I need you to know that I understand why you were so worried about me coming here. It's because you love me, and I love you too, even when I'm too stupid to say it right. I think about home every day. I think about Sunday dinners and Mom's terrible meatloaf, and Dad working in the garage, and you correcting my grammar, even when I'm not asking for help. I think about the way you used to read to me when I was little, and you thought I was asleep. I think about how you taught me to ride a bike, and how you punched Tommy Morrison when he made fun of my stutter in 3rd grade. If I don't make it back, I need you to know that you were the best big sister a guy could ask for. You taught me how to be brave by watching you be brave every day. You taught me how to stand up for people who need help. You taught me that being smart and kind is better than being tough. Don't be sad for too long, okay? Live your life. Fall in love. Have kids and name one of them after me, but spell it right this time. Become the amazing teacher you always wanted to be. Change the world like I know you will. And Maggie, take care of Mom and Dad. They're gonna need you more than they'll let on. I love you, sis. Thanks for making me the man I turned out to be. Your baby brother, Michael P.S. Tell Chen thanks for keeping his promise. He's a good man." Margaret read the letter 3 times before she could speak. Tears streamed down her face, but for the first time in 50 years, they weren't tears of guilt and regret. They were tears of relief, of forgiveness, of a love that had transcended time and death to finally reach her. "He forgave me," she whispered. "There was nothing to forgive," James said gently. "He never blamed you for anything." Margaret looked up at James, really seeing him for the first time since he had arrived. "You kept this promise for 50 years. You never gave up looking for me." James shrugged. "A promise is a promise. Besides, Michael was my friend. We looked out for each other over there. Will you tell me about him? About what he was like over there?" James smiled, and for a moment Margaret could see the young soldier he had been. He was the guy everyone wanted on their squad. Not because he was the best shot or the strongest, but because he never left anyone behind. He wrote letters for the guys who couldn't write. He shared his care packages with anyone who didn't get mail. And he never stopped believing we were all going to make it home. Margaret nodded, recognizing the brother she had raised. "That sounds like Michael." "There's something else," James said. "Something I've been wondering about for 50 years. Michael mentioned that fight you had about a watch. He said you were keeping something safe for him? Margaret's eyes widened. You mean? Would you like me to help you keep the rest of his promise? Margaret led James upstairs to her bedroom, to the jewelry box that had sat untouched on her dresser for 5 decades. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, was their grandfather's pocket watch, still shining, still keeping perfect time. I wound it every week, Margaret said quietly. I don't know why. Maybe I hoped he'd come home for it someday. James held the watch carefully, feeling its weight. He would have loved to carry this with him. But you were right to keep it safe. Too many good things got lost over there. I want you to have it, Margaret said suddenly. James looked startled. Ma'am, I couldn't. This is your family's. You brought my brother home to me, Margaret interrupted. After 50 years, you brought him home. You kept your promise when it would have been so easy to forget. Michael would want you to have it. James accepted the watch with the same reverence he had shown the letter. I'll treasure it. There's something else I want to ask you, Margaret said as they returned to the living room. Would you help me with something? Something Michael mentioned in his letter? 3 weeks later, Margaret stood in front of a classroom for the first time in 15 years. But this wasn't the elementary school where she had spent her career teaching children to read and write. This was the Cedar Falls Community Center, and her students were local veterans and their families. The Lost Letters Project had started as a simple idea. If James had spent 50 years carrying one undelivered letter, how many other messages were out there, waiting to find their way home? How many families were still wondering what their loved ones had wanted to say in those final moments? Margaret had contacted the local VFW, the American Legion, and the Gold Star Families Organization. She had put notices in newspapers and on social media. And slowly, they had started coming. Veterans carrying letters from fallen comrades, families with decades-old mysteries, children who had never known their military parents but had found hints of unfinished correspondence. James became her co-coordinator, and together they had created something neither of them had expected. A community of people united by loss but determined to heal. They organized search efforts, connected families with veterans organizations, and created a database of undelivered letters and the people looking for them. The response was overwhelming. Letters began arriving from across the country, not just from Vietnam, but from Korea, World War II, Iraq, Afghanistan. Each one carried the weight of unfinished love, unspoken forgiveness, undelivered hope. Margaret read each letter that came through their project, and each one reminded her of the gift James had given her. The gift of closure, of peace, of knowing that love really did transcend time and distance. On the first anniversary of the Lost Letters Project, Margaret and James organized a ceremony at the Cedar Falls Memorial Park. Families who had been reunited with final messages from their loved ones gathered to share their stories and honor the volunteers who had made it possible. James stood at the podium, the grandfather's pocket watch chain visible across his vest, and spoke about the power of keeping promises. Margaret watched from the audience, surrounded by the families they had helped, and felt something she hadn't experienced in 50 years. The sense that she was exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she was supposed to do. After the ceremony, as the crowd dispersed and the evening shadows grew long, Margaret and James walked together to Michael's grave. Margaret had never been able to visit it before. The headstone had seemed too final, too much like accepting that he was really gone. But now, with his letter in her purse and his watch on James's chain, and the knowledge that his final thoughts had been of love and forgiveness, she could finally say goodbye. "Thank you," she said to the headstone. "Thank you for forgiving me. Thank you for loving me. Thank you for sending James to find me." As they walked back to the car, James paused. "You know, I've been thinking about what Michael wrote in that letter. About you changing the world by teaching kids." Margaret smiled. "I did teach for 40 years. I hope I made some difference." "I think you're still teaching," James said. "Just different students now. You're teaching all of us that it's never too late to heal, never too late to forgive, never too late to come home." Margaret looked back at the memorial park, where families were still lingering, still sharing stories, still finding peace in connection with others who understood their loss. Maybe that's what Michael meant, she said. Maybe the teaching never really ends. 5 years after James Chen knocked on Margaret O'Sullivan's door, the Lost Letters Project had facilitated the delivery of over 3,000 letters, connected more than 1,500 families with closure, and created a network of volunteers across all 50 states. Margaret, now 78, still coordinated the project from her kitchen table. The same table where she had once said goodbye to her brother in anger, and where she had finally welcomed him home in love. James, at 94, remained her partner in the work, though he moved more slowly now and needed help with the computer database. The project had grown beyond their wildest imagination. Documentary filmmakers had told their story. Authors had written books about the healing power of final letters. Military families across the world had started similar projects in their communities. But for Margaret and James, the real victory wasn't in the numbers or the recognition. It was in moments like the one that happened on a Tuesday afternoon in spring, when a young Marine knocked on their door with a letter his grandfather had carried home from Normandy in 1944, looking for the French family who had hidden American soldiers from the Nazis. Or the phone call from a woman in California who had found a bundle of letters in her late father's closet, letters from Vietnamese soldiers to their families, letters her father had collected as a translator but never been able to deliver before the war ended. Each letter was a life, a love, a loss, a hope. Each delivery was a small miracle, a circle closed, a promise kept. Margaret often thought about the fight she and Michael had before he left for Vietnam. She understood now that it hadn't been about a watch at all. It had been about fear and love and the terrible helplessness of watching someone you care about walk into danger. But love, she had learned, was stronger than fear. Love was stronger than time. Love was stronger than death. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, love found a way to come home. Margaret still lived in the same house where Michael had grown up, but she had finally changed his bedroom. Not erased it, but transformed it into the project's headquarters. His trophies shared shelf space with filing cabinets full of correspondence. His desk now held computers and phones instead of homework. But his poster of Jimi Hendrix still hung on the wall, and Margaret often imagined she could hear her brother's terrible singing echoing from the speakers as she worked late into the evening, helping other families find their way back to each other. The grandfather's pocket watch still kept perfect time on James's chain. And every morning, as Margaret sat at her kitchen table with her coffee and her correspondence from families seeking closure, she felt Michael's presence as clearly as if he were sitting across from her, complaining about her coffee being too strong and asking what he could do to help. She had learned that some promises take a lifetime to keep, but they're always worth the wait. And in the end, love always finds a way home. The Lost Letters Project continues today, connecting families with closure and keeping promises across time. If you have a story of undelivered correspondence or need help finding closure with a loved one's service, remember that some bonds are stronger than time, and love always finds a way. If this story moved you, please share it with someone who needs to know that it's never too late for forgiveness, never too late for love, and never too late to come home.